like I'm a pretty nice, pretty left-leaning person, but I think that there needs to be some space for a certain level of like almost elitism within psychology because there's just a lot of really
Or not so much that we've destigmatized mental illness. Now we've made it like kind of sexy and like kind of cool. I need to like sit down and collect my thoughts on this, but like there's probably like a couple big things that play into why people are so big on these. One is probably,
I started on TikTok. So when
oh
I'm talking
God.
about it, I'm actually I know.
Oh, I've heard the
Um,
problems are like even more extreme on TikTok
it
because
is
that's where the
it,
DID shit came from. I don't know if we're gonna do that or not, but yeah.
yeah, we can get into DID.
A lot of women would probably be turned off by that in certain situations, even if they say otherwise. When we talk about eliminating gender roles, the point wasn't to make it so that you were shamed for doing traditional stuff. It was that you had an option not to. Like that's.
What about his I'd be curious what like which historical takes of his that you like hate. I don't know if I'd push back today just because
Yeah.
I'd have to think
Fuck.
about it
I
more,
have to.
but
I think talking about how like the Nazis were like atheists, and that was like a huge driving force of like what made them what they were, or I know he said other things in the past. I would have to go through and dig shit out. I just know that most of the time he dives into anything political. It makes me want to. It just I'm cringing out the window. His obsession with the C-16 shit and Canada, I think is like generally like pretty dumb. Yeah, I don't know. I just literally, I would have to go through another Joe Rogan. Oh, I feel like he is. I feel like sometimes he is a little bit irresponsible with how he does conversations. Where if I say something is descriptive versus prescriptive, do you understand the difference between that?
um
That like
I think so, yeah.
yeah,
But
he'll
maybe
do
just
these.
define it for us
Sure,
too.
he'll do these things where he'll lay out a whole bunch of descriptively true claims, and it seems like he's almost like implying the prescription, but he'll never say it, and then people will like accuse him of saying it, and then he'll get really like offended. So like I know he's had conversations before about like women in the workplace, and he'll say all these things about like, oh well, makeup does this, and we fight more now, and all this and that and that and that, but he'll never come out and like give a solution or even suggest a solution for it. He'll just list all these problems, and I think that's why his fan base tends to skew pretty far right sometimes, is because people will hear this and be like, oh well, damn, women need to get the fuck out of the workplace, obviously based on what he's saying. But then when somebody confronts Jordan Peterson with like the obvious like end road of what he's saying, he'll always like, oh well, I didn't say that, I never ever said that, like, you know. And it's like, okay, well, why don't, maybe it would be good to pair like a suggestion sometimes with what's going on, because it feels like it's really easy to take some of the descriptive claims you're making and run down a very scary prescriptive road. That's probably the biggest criticism I have of him sometimes, I think.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I could definitely understand that. Especially like that was one of the main things I heard of his, where I was like, I've watched enough of his lectures and stuff that I could probably disentangle what he was actually implying. But absolutely, I think people like less engaged with his work or just like less thinking about it. The words he uses, I think one big criticism I'd have of him just like as a speaker is he has a lot of like descriptive meanings for certain words that mean a lot to him that don't entirely match how common parlance uses it, like the word chaos, right?
Oh,
Like
sure.
chaos is a big word for him. It has a very specific meaning to him, but it's not quite how we use chaos here, right? Like chaos is a little bit negative in our culture, right? And so I can understand why he gets tired of having to like explain it all the time of what he means by chaos. But I do think like there's a certain level of like responsibility as a public speaker of like it is annoying to have to constantly re-explain, but you shouldn't assume that everyone just knows what you're talking about,
Oh,
even
yeah.
if you're like pretty well established. Yeah. Um, ooh, I could launch more into the stuff about the Iron Curtain of
Oh, yeah,
academic psychology a little bit more.
go for it.
Just I think that's a really important conversation, just even based on like recent events that have been like popping off in Twitch that you've been involved in and stuff. I think it's really important to actually like clarify the science of psychology a lot.
Sure.
So a lot of people aren't aware that there's a massive difference between a counseling psychologist and like a researching psychologist, right? It seems like you're deeply familiar with this
Yes,
at
two
this point.
fundamentally different
Probably,
things that
yeah.
counselors can fall into a lot of cognitive traps. Even for doctors, it's true. Where like a doctor might have like a certain regimen and he feels like this works really well with patients, even though the research might say something different, and that you run into a lot of individual problems theoretically with counselors that have more on the ground experience with researchers that might be looking at larger sets of data sometimes, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's an issue where I find, at least on social media, there's a lot of like, so in general, I'm pretty opposed to like academic elitism. and it feels weird to say this because in like I'm a pretty nice, pretty left-leaning person, but
Hmm.
I think that there needs to be some space for a certain level of like almost elitism within psychology because there's just a lot of really bad training institutes and rigor within psychology that
Sure.
started, I think, actually with good intentions,
Hmm.
but the effect that it's having is really concerning to me. So, for
Yeah.
example, in psychology, there's
I
a
was
big
one real
difference.
thing before you get into it.
Yeah.
A friend told me this. I was going to tweet this out, but I just decided not to. But this conversation broadly can probably describe it as like gatekeeping is good sometimes. Like there might be times where it's important, where there's actually a real value in gatekeeping certain topics from certain individuals because it's important to keep the conversations responsible and grounded in terms of like the
Yeah.
evidence of the data. Yeah. All right, go for it.
Yeah. That's a really good point, right? And I would say, like, with what we're seeing right now with mental health, it is beyond evident to me that psychology hasn't been careful enough.
Hmm.
Right? Advocacy and kind of popularizing psychology really started blowing up, at least like in fields that I was hearing about. Like, a lot of people were talking about, like, how do we get like the common people to know about mental health and understand it. And the goal was to reduce stigma, right? It was a
Hmm.
good intention. And then we started putting in the hands of people lots of information about psychology, but we hadn't even worked out amongst ourselves as academics who actually was um, experts on things and who wasn't. And there was still kind of this like unspoken thing that everyone was just like too nice to address, right? Which is a lot of people who maybe have you ever heard of a PsyD versus a PhD?
No, I probably heard of this before, but no, tell me.
So a PhD, everyone kind of knows it's a doctorate in philosophy. That's
Hmm.
what almost everyone gets,
Hmm.
including psychologists. And then a couple of psychological schools was like, hey, let's do a PsyD, which is a doctorate of psychology. Um, so it's a doctorate. It's just they're trying to equivocate it to a PhD.
Hmm.
They're just trying to be like, but we're really specialized in psychology. The problem is that a lot of PsyD programs, so there's different theoretical models of training in psychology.
Hmm.
So if you go to like a clinical psych program, usually, although I'm not sure what clinical psych program our one friend is in because I'm very confused by some of the things that said, but generally it has a scientist practitioner model.
One friend. Are you
That's
talking about the person that I talked to on stream about this?
yes.
Or are you talking about a person that I've had personal problems with on stream?
Yeah, like yesterday's drama.
Okay, never mind. Yeah, okay, gotcha. I'm trying not to talk about
Yeah.
that person right now, but okay, go for it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm just
I'm
I'm
just trying
just
to I'm trying to
clarifying.
understand who you're talking about. But yeah, okay, I understand what you're
Yeah,
saying. Okay,
I'm
go for
just
it.
clarifying because I'm going to kind of set clinical psych
Hmm.
as like a bit of a precedent,
Hmm.
which makes me nervous because I know that that individual identifies as a clinical psych, and
Sure.
I'm not really sure what to do with that basically.
Okay, yeah.
But basically, clinical psych programs usually have a scientist practitioner model, so they try to emphasize data, empiricism. They want to make sure that you know your research, you know
Hmm.
your methodology, and you understand statistics first and foremost before you're trying to help people.
Hmm.
And there were some really legitimate critiques brought forward by a PhD in counseling psychology. So that
Hmm.
was kind of the next phase of psychology. And I think there was a really legitimate critique in that you got like a lot of really sciencey nerds. It's kind of the issue of like there's lots of really great doctors who know their science, but man, they're not great with people, right?
Sure.
And we were having a lot of these issues. As somebody who's like worked with both counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists, I'd broadly also agree. Like there's a lot of clinical psychologists and PhDs who just like will be like working with teens together and
Hmm.
like they're like hey buddy and they like clearly don't know how to talk to kids,
Sure.
whereas like a counseling psychologist might. So counseling psychologists came in and they said let's do more of a scholar practitioner model.
Okay.
Okay. And so this was more of an emphasis on like the art of human interaction. So they're less concerned with like rigid, high empirical, quantitative data. They're more concerned with how do people at an emergent level operate? What do relationships look like? How do they engage with one another? And how do you support them in a healing journey? Right? That was like the big focus of it.
Okay.
Um, and this started producing really excellent counselors, like legitimately excellent counselors.
Hmm.
The problem is that those counseling psychologists started occupying certain roles that originally clinical psychologists were supposed to, in part because they were better with people. But then they started making scientific claims that they felt they were authorities on that sometimes weren't always entirely reflective of the actual science of psychology, or it was maybe old, right? It was kind of post dated because they'd been out of school for 10 years and they
Hmm.
just didn't know that the science had been updated. Um, And so that problem started happening a fair bit. And so there's a lot of clinical psychologists who are like, yeah, counseling psychologists are psychologists too, but with lots of implications. But nobody would say what those implications precisely were, other than being like, but they're not like as trained as us on empiricism was kind of the implication a lot of the time, but nobody said it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wanted to like be mean in psychology. So we just kind of like, we're like, fine, you can be psychologist too. We'll just kind of like battle you in academic ground sometimes. And
Mm-hmm.
like the researching psychologists would sometimes just get frustrated with practitioners, and practitioners vice versa would get frustrated being like, hey, these studies are like empirically sound, but also like completely unrelated to how humans actually work, right?
Sure.
Which is a valid critique both ways. Then CIDES happened, and I'm still not fully sure why they happened. It's not really clear to me like where it came from, why it got established. Um, but it really kind of tried to, trying to think of how to say this. They took like a scholar practitioner model or a scientist practitioner model, and then they tried to make a practitioner scholar model, just to be nice and confusing.
Okay.
And so this model really emphasized first and foremost is the art of people, and after that is like the theories, right? And so a lot of times what I find with PsyDs is that they've done lots of practicums, they've worked with a lot of people, but they probably have the least rigorous amount of empirical um, training.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
But again, because we're nice, nobody wanted to say that they're not psychologists because they are technically licensed psychologists, right? And nobody's going to strip them of their
Sure.
like 10 plus years of hard work, right?
Can I summarize what you've said so far, and you tell me if I'm understanding what you're saying?
Sure.
So in psychology, we study empirical things, but people that study empirical things are usually losers and nerds who nobody wants to talk to. And so having somebody go up to a patient and say, you know that if you continue this behavior, you're going to have a 42% chance of committing suicide, is not like a good way, right? So we have these people that are nice, that are therapists or counselors, or the other side of it, the clinical side of it. And these are the people that are better at like taking, ideally you have a model where you've got a group of people that are doing empirical research, and then they're from there giving recommendations how to treat people. And then you've got on the other side of it, a person that's like, okay, I'm going to take this information, I'm going to distill it down so that an individual can understand it. Yeah. And then the issue now is that the people that are on the clinical side have a new thing called a PsyD, where they can pretend to be both understanding the clinical side and the data side, but the data side they don't seem to have as good a grasp as they should on it if they're going to make those types of claims that they do have a good grasp on it. Is it kind of...
Yeah,
Okay.
I've never in the field broadly, I haven't been overly impressed with PsyD achievers' empirical knowledge.
Gotcha.
I've been very dubious of it, and I've heard them making certain claims that reflect a lot more of pop psychology than actual academic psychology. And that really concerns me because there's a lot of people in pop psychology that aren't even in the field of psychology. They're like social workers and stuff like that. And it's like, you shouldn't really be claiming yourself to be an expert on psychology if you're a social worker, because you're not. You're definitely, even if you're a clinical social worker, I would still argue you're not a specialist in psychology, which is, again, I'm just like stepping on the toes of everyone in my field just slightly, just to make as many enemies as possible. But I think it's a really legitimate concern because then when lay people look at the field, who do they look to as saying what's actually true, right? If I Google something like abuse, right? If I Google abuse with Google, I'm going to come up mostly with pop psychology, almost exclusively.
Yeah.
Right?
So this is academics' fault. I will largely say. I think that academics need to do a way better job at communicating common ideas to other people. Otherwise, you will always find yourself at the mercy of whatever pop figure decides to do this. This happens in every single field, I think, where like, maybe not. It doesn't happen in every single field. I know it happens in philosophy, for instance, where who are the greatest philosophers of our time? Everybody's going to tell you the pop psychology or the pop philosophers. And then same thing probably when it comes to psychology too. People are going to be way more attuned to pop psychology. But these are like, the way that these things are written are oftentimes more engaging and more fun. And, you know, they might talk about cool things like the dark triad instead of boring things like, well, what's the subclinical evaluation of like blah, 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 like, you know. And it seems like, I guess I'm a little harsh on that, but like, yeah, it feels like sometimes academics need to do a much better job at making their stuff more presentable, or have like a wing of their institution that makes it more presentable, because otherwise you're always ceding all of that ground in popular culture to the people that are going to be the more entertaining figures that aren't as rigorous or studious when it comes to understanding the material itself.
Yeah, I think it's a really big issue. It's something I actually like challenge like fellow academics with all the time, because there's a lot of them where I'm like, you're so brilliant, like just come and talk about it and find like fun ways to explain it. And they're like, I just don't really want to do the social media rat race. And I'm like, that's super fair. But like, if nobody's calling these people out, and then when the minority who does call them out, academics basically like oftentimes will cowardly just like back down and be like, we don't really want to deal with this. So like, you know, if there's like a researcher who kind of speaks out against certain things, and then pop psychology like absolutely vilifies them, goes on kind of a brigade to attack them. Oftentimes schools would prefer to just be like, maybe just don't work here anymore. We don't really want to deal with it. They're like true quintessential stability boomers, where they just in a lot of ways are just like, just don't disturb us. We'll leave you alone so we can just kind of keep doing our science. Like go away basically, which I think is a really big problem, especially because it's like psychology is like the art of the human mind. It's what like everyone is interested in it because it's about yourself. And so it's the science that is the most difficult to do. It is the most rigorous process to do any good science with. You can barely make any like causal claims ever. And it is absolutely going to be misrepresented, and you need to be on top of it.
And it's one of those things where I say the same with philosophy and psychology. You don't have to be an academic to practice either of these things, because you're doing them constantly, right? Like we use psychology when we're having conversations with friends, when we're raising our children. Like literally every part of your life is going to involve interactions that fall under the domain of psychology or philosophy as well. And we decide like what is right or wrong. We make decisions on like, should we do this? How do we, you know, and it's very frustrating sometimes, because I know there was some frustration when the alt-right was growing in 2016 and the race realist stuff was getting a little bit more popular, not like super mainstream, but pretty popular. There's a lot of people, me included, that are kind of like looking to the academic world, and it's like, are you guys gonna like say or do anything? And I remember I would send out, because this is back when I was emailing professors, I would send out emails and stuff, and generally the response is just like, we don't really have those conversations. We don't really do that. We don't really like, we're not gonna come out and be like public debaters or have arguments over this. Like this is just not, and it's like, okay, well, what the fuck? Like, what the fuck is the purpose of what you're doing? If you lose the battle culturally, it doesn't really matter what happens in the academic institution, because now policies are going to follow based on kind of like the cultural zeitgeist or the cultural feeling of a particular thing. And that unwillingness of an academic to kind of step into the mainstream, I think is really frustrating sometimes, because I think that voice is really needed and sorely lacking.
Yeah. And I think like that's something that like I can always appreciate about Jordan Peterson, especially within the field, is that he did step into it. He absolutely got put through the rigor, and he also got a lot of success out of it, right? He wasn't just a victim the entire time by any means. But I can really appreciate like the bravery that it took. And a lot of people tried to be like, he's a terrible scientist. He doesn't know anything about like psychology science. And I'm like, that's just not true. Like he just does. Like he does quite well. And you like can disagree with his political takes, that's fine, but like his knowledge on psychology is pretty solid. Like, and he's at least talking about it. Like nobody else is even trying to talk about it, right? He's at least willing to be like, hey, academics, like probably we should try to talk about this.
Which is one of the reasons why I get even more frustrated with his political takes, because something that's very frustrating, and I'm sure you know this, is humans have a very binary understanding of other humans. You're either all good or all bad. And that's like the extent to which 99% of people can deal with somebody. And I constantly have to remind my audience of this, because like if I watch, somebody will link me like a Jordan Peterson video, we all hate Jordan Peterson. So it's very easy to get like a video and he'll say something like, women are unhappier today than they were 40 years ago. It's like, he's lying. I know that he's a liar, conservative piece of shit. It's like, well, hold on. That's not necessarily true. That's not a lie, okay? This is like super well founded in the data. And it sucks because he made himself so political now that like every statement he says, but I won't just blame him actually, because I think people on the left in general are sometimes a little bit afraid to grapple with kind of harsh truths in reality. Like we have to be able to have a conversation about this, not because we agree with it or we want it to be the same or we want to regress back to 50 years ago, but because like we have to be able to understand that a problem exists before we can even start to like, address it or solve it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, absolutely. I think addressing of like the binary understanding is really important, and I think it's something that like again, psychology, like not that I think psychology is like a solve all for world problems. I hate it when like any field tries to pretend like they're like the only solution to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But like this is where like really good mental health education is really important, right? Because what I'm seeing right now is there's this binary now happening with like psychological labels, right? Where somebody will be like, oh, well, they're a narcissist. They'll
Uh,
just like self-diagnose somebody as a narcissist.
mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? Well, now that means you're a monster. Nothing you say matters. You're an abuser usually as well,
Mm-hmm.
and fuck you.
Yeah.
That's all it means,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like that that's not a very comprehensive understanding of what any mental health disorder is, right? We have to
Mm-hmm.
be, especially because like just personality disorders in general right now are like really sexy.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be really careful because personality disorders are much more extreme mental health problems.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure like maybe you'd have a better understanding of like I honestly was like flabbergasted when I saw specifically like personality disorders blowing up as like labels in pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just like didn't expect it at all. Because like they're decently like rare. I was expecting things like anxiety and depression to blow up, which they like did.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't feel like there's like nearly the like lacing of um
Yeah. I,
villainy attached to them as like there are with like PD. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on that.
I read a really interesting paper a while ago. It was really boring. Fuck, somebody might have the link to it. But basically, in this paper, the author, I think it was a woman, she explores that basically mental illness used to be highly stigmatized in society. Even in my lifetime, I'm 33, even as a child, like highly stigmatized. People with depression were losers. Anxiety was something you're just supposed to get over. And God forbid, if you're a man and you have these problems, you're basically a woman. You might as well be like, you're just worthless to society. Like in 90s, early 2000s, like men weren't allowed to have these types of emotional problems, even in my lifetime. And that's radically changed. But it seems like in the goal to be more tolerating of these conversations, the pendulum has swung a bit too far to where it's not so much now that we're just like tolerating these conversations, or not so much that we've destigmatized mental illness. Now we've made it like kind of sexy and like kind of cool. And you have this, I haven't sit. I need to like sit down and collect my thoughts on this, but like there's probably like a couple big things that play into why people are so big on these. One is probably being a victim is a lot of fun. You get a lot of like easy attention for it. It absolves you of a lot of bad actions. It gives it like you have a reason, you know, why you are in the place you're in life. Like, well, it's my like. I talk to a lot of people. I don't know if you've seen this. People will frame sometimes daily decisions through their self-diagnosed mental illnesses. Like, I might be like, hey, like, did you finish this book or whatever? And they'll be like, oh no, I can't finish any book because of my ADHD or something. They'll say something like that. Like, their whole life is kind of then so this. That's probably one big one, and then the second really big one is I think today, especially with social media, everybody really wants to be unique, and everybody really wants to have like certain types of like cool reasons why they're like a unique and interesting person. And I mean, like the most common person on the internet is probably going to be like a cis white person, and damn, is that fucking boring. So if we're not gonna dip into gender identities or something else to like find some cool shit, then like sexy mental illnesses are now the way to do it. So you'll have people with these Twitter profiles, and for the life of me, I don't know why the fuck you would ever write a mental illness in your Twitter profile, but they'll have in their profiles now like autistic / GAD / depressed, blah blah blah. Like people are just like outwardly advertising it, and then everything related to that identity. It's not even used as like a source of like I have these issues, and so I'm identifying that so I can improve on them. It's more just like I have these issues so that I can kind of like tell jokes about them, and you know, like relate to other people about how like funny these things are, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify, when I'm talking about like people overusing labels like narcissism and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I started on TikTok. So when
Oh
I'm talking
God.
about it, I'm actually I know.
Oh, I've heard the problems are like even more extreme on TikTok
It
because
is.
that's where the DID shit came from. I don't know if we're gonna do that or not, but yeah.
Yeah, we can get into DID. It's something actually that I differed on a couple of the professionals that you've talked to because it's a really contentious issue. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, on I started on TikTok where part of why I started posting and stuff like that was because like narcissism was like the word on TikTok for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, just so it's clear, narcissism is super rare. Like we
Mm-hmm.
don't really have even good prevalence studies on it. Like
Mm-hmm.
depending on where you look for, prevalence ranges from 0.01% to 6%,
Mm-hmm.
right? 6% is almost at like GAD level. So I'm very dubious of the 6%.
Sure.
Clinically, as somebody who's worked in forensic settings, which if somebody's a narcissist, particularly if they're like a narcissist, somebody with actual narcissism
Mm-hmm.
who also has like see them in forensic settings.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a lot of them end up, right?
Wait a
I
second, real quick. When you
truly,
use that word, when you say in forensic settings, does this mean settings related to like criminal justice or crime or?
yeah, sorry.
Okay.
So when I say forensic psychology, it's talking about like jail. Sorry, I keep trying to say forensic settings. Yeah, jail, halfway houses,
Gotcha. Okay.
anything to do with that kind of crime in the judicial system.
Okay, gotcha. Just make sure I understand. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And so it's really frustrating as somebody who's like, I've worked with a number of people. I've met a psychopath once.
Mm-hmm.
Like somebody who,
Is that
I
this
mean,
conversation or I'm just fucking with you. Okay.
it's this one, yeah. No. And to be clear, psychopathy isn't diagnosable in the DSM,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because psychiatrists don't like any diagnosis that only has one measurement to assess it. But the problem is that the measurement made for it is like pretty much gold fucking standard. We still use it today, the PCLR.
Okay.
But it's not actually DSM recognized. They would only be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and they'd be considered severe, right? But just people like abusing words like psychopath and narcissism. It's like I've seen one psychopath. I've seen maybe one narcissist, but they weren't diagnosed. And like I wasn't going to diagnose them. I'm not, I can't diagnose like at this point yet. Yeah, it was just, it's really frustrating to see like everyone talking about it because it's like, look, it's tricky because you don't want to like dismiss the suffering, right? Of being like, I totally believe that you've like gone through you've like, I believe that you were even potentially abused by an ex. Like, absolutely. It's not about discrediting that. It's just about saying like, let's be careful about our language here, please.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you label somebody with a narcissist, to be honest, like you kind of have written them off.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're labeling them with a personality disorder,
Mm-hmm.
which is what people write off people with personality disorders a lot.
And my understanding is that a
narcissism.
personality disorder, generally, I think with borderline maybe being the only exception, personality disorders are generally considered like non-perceivable by the person that has them, right? Like it's not like an independent, like an external, it's like a cancer or a tumor. It's like kind of who they are. And I think that those are considered relatively like immovable, that like maybe you can kind of manage the parts of a personality disorder, but you're never going to become not a narcissist or something, I think is my understanding. Is that true or is that not true?
That is true, with the caveat of saying like borderline personality disorder is one personality disorder that I think is probably very unique.
Yeah.
In that I've definitely seen people with borderline personality disorder do a lot of trauma work, do a lot of DBT, and then by the end of their like treatment, even though once you're diagnosed with a personality disorder, it's considered a chronic condition.
Yeah.
They're so much capable of managing it that you wouldn't even be able to tell, right? And they might still like they might report like internal experiences of it. Whereas like anybody who's like a narcissist, right? Again, they're very rarely diagnosed. There isn't a self-evident form of treatment for them. And so it's like you rarely see those people like move into a lot, like you might call like, I don't know, remission might be, it's not the right word. It's a much like too medicalized word. I would say there's a lot of people again with BPD that are decently self-aware of it. There seems to be like a mixture. I've definitely worked with BPD people who are highly self-aware of it.
This is why I think I said at the beginning, I was like, I think borderline is the only personality disorder I've heard that doesn't fall into that category of the personality disorders where it's like the person doesn't generally perceive it. Usually I think somebody with borderline, because of the conflicts they have with others and everything, usually can perceive that like something is very wrong with me. Whereas like people with narcissism or the other personality disorders who are like, this is just the way that I am. I don't think there's anything wrong with me. Like this is just who I am.
Yeah, I just objectively am better than other people, like obviously,
sure.
right? And that's a big thing people miss with narcissism is they're like, well, they're like assholes and they like take advantage of people. And I'm like, okay, but like the major trademark of somebody with narcissism personality disorder is the self-grandiosity that doesn't match them. So it's really hard to diagnose somebody who's maybe like super like, I'm a Giga Chad and I'm a top dog, and then they are, right? They're like one of the top athletes in the world. It's really hard to call that a narcissist. It sure is fucking annoying, right? They're probably pompous. They definitely are like probably elitist, but it's hard to diagnose them as narcissists because, again, the one client who I said there might have been some narcissism going on, they like had this strong, almost delusional belief that they were going to be like an incredible famous rapper and they were the best at rapping, and then they would like perform and it was like not great, right? That's where we're seeing like actual true narcissism.
For sure.
And people are like, well, what about covert and overt and blah 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 blah, but it's like covert and overt aren't even like agreed on by the academics yet, so we need to be careful before we like throw them out at people.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I feel like we went on a weird side tangent, so I can kind of try to go back to my prep. I don't want to just like jump around. Maybe going back to your statement about like the romanticization and like how you're saying like it's kind of sexy to have mental health problems. I think that's a really important actually conversation to be having, because I've actually talked a fair bit, even just on TikTok, about like my concern about the romanticization of mental health problems and how there's actually going to be like motivation to claim a mental health problem when there's not, particularly like you said, like with the excusing of behavior, right? Like, oh well, I have ADHD, so I just can't do these things, and it's like, okay, there are absolutely like a deck of cards where certain things are going to be much more difficult for you to manage, and you need to like work through that. But to say that you just can't is decently unlikely. And my question to go, what supports can we give to you to make this more accessible to you? Right.
The thing that I try not to blow up at people that say shit, but like anytime I hear anybody frame something through, especially a self-diagnosed mental illness, is so incredibly frustrating to me. I get just like my understanding is that, like, not my understanding, I'll be more firm in this, the whole point of any diagnosis for anything ever is to give a treatment to something. Like, we don't just diagnose things like, oh, you have this and now you're fucked, good luck, right? The goal is to be able to manage some ailment or manage a symptom or to make an accommodation so that somebody can live like a better life. When I see people self-diagnose with a certain mental illness and then they use that, like, oh, well, I can't do that because of this, or, oh, it's just this is my thing keeping me, and oh, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, Jesus, like, what the fuck? Like, one, you don't even know if you have this, and then two, even if you do, it's not going to be like the limiting factor of like every behavior you could possibly have. Like, it's so frustrating to hear somebody limit themselves that way, especially on something they might not even have. Yeah, that's a really irritating conversation to have.
Yeah, it's irritating because it's like, especially as somebody in the field, right? Like, there's this piece where it's like, I absolutely want to like maintain compassion for people, right? I don't want to be like an asshole and say that you're not suffering, right? The problem is that sometimes your suffering might not have a descriptive label that well applies to it. That doesn't mean that you're not suffering. It means that, like, unfortunately right now, like, you're absolutely an individual who might be falling through the gaps a little bit. And so we can have conversations about what to do about people who are falling through the gaps, or we're like individuals who like have childhood trauma, and so no diagnosis perfectly fits for them, because childhood trauma just does very like diverse, but very like oftentimes pernicious things to people's like development and coping and attachment. Right? So there isn't like a good label we can give it. But at the same time, not kind of encouraging people to like find their identity and being like, I'm just broken and that's the end of it, right? And it's just like, there's a lot more that you can do always, and not just you, right? Because like, I don't want to just be like, just like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like it's all on you. But it's like, there's also a lot more supports that can be had if we can have accurate diagnosis. And I'm really glad that you talk about the purpose of a diagnosis, because it like probably one of the, as I'm probably biased because I'm a psychometrician, so like diagnosis is like heart of things, but it is so important to understand that effective diagnosis of mental health is, this is one thing I really disagreed with some of the people you've talked to, where they said like diagnosis is easy. You can do it in like 6 weeks. Anyone can do it. It is not easy at all. It takes a lot of time. You need to be really, really, really fucking careful. Because mental health is a soft science. The categories that we outline for different diagnoses shift and change every like 10 to 13 years. And the fact that the science itself is shifting and changing means that, of course, these things are somewhat ambiguous. And so like just throwing labels on yourself or on others, or even like, it's just, diagnosis is it's so key because absolutely it informs treatment, right? The way you treat somebody with anxiety and PTSD is decently different,
Yeah.
right? The way you treat somebody with depression versus anxiety is also very different.
Something that is really frustrating to me, that I brought up to one of the guys, or maybe two of the people I was talking to, is that like I feel like if I had a patient that came in and I could tell that they'd already read about a particular thing they think they have, I don't know if I would even want to work with that person because they'll already have, like, sometimes I've wondered if I either have ADHD or autism, and I don't even know if I would if I would trust myself to do a test, because I think I know the answers sometimes that I would need to give. Like when I see like the online tests are probably easier, but like you'll see a thing where it's like, like when you talk to a particular person, like, do you feel like you are understanding them, or do you feel like you're doing well? And it's like, okay, well, if I'm autistic, I should answer this one, right? I feel like even for myself, I don't know if I would trust myself to take those tests. But when you get somebody that comes in and you're like, oh, do you think that you have like, or what's wrong with you? Tell me what's wrong. And the first thing they say is, well, I think that I have ADHD. I think that I have a lot of hyperfocus. I think that my, oh God, what's the name for your executive function processor? Like when they start using language like this, it feels like it's already game over. Like I couldn't imagine getting a patient that comes in thinking they have X whatever mental illness, and then you're like, the one thing would be to give them an alternative, which I think would probably still be good because at least they still have something to latch onto. But if you're like, no, I don't think you fit this at all, I feel like that patient is never coming back. They're just going to shop around for something else until they find somebody that like, this guy finally understands, I do have this thing, you know?
Yeah. And it's really scary, and I don't know what to do about it because I've actually watched people doctor shop to the point because they're convinced that they have like something like BPD, and they go to multiple psychologists and multiple doctors, and they're like, I don't think you do, and they just keep rotating until they found somebody who would validate that diagnosis. And this individual absolutely did not present with the symptoms of it before, and now they absolutely do, right? And it's like, well, what the fuck is that, right? Like, what the fuck happened there?
Yeah.
And that's really concerning to me, of like, you don't want, like, psychology education shouldn't be causing people to actually be functioning worse within 2 years of getting like taught about like symptomology, right? Like that's really scary. I mean, when it comes to the autism thing, I would say like the ADOS, which is like this, it's actually how like you properly diagnose autism. I'm not even trained in it. Even in a psychometrician who did like an extra year of just training on tests, the ADOS training is still like even beyond that. It's really extensive.
Sure.
And it's like a full day's worth of testing. And it's really, really rigorous. So like that would be something I'd be like, you probably could go actually get tested for that, and it would be like decently sound, because it's not things you can always like cheat on, right? Because it's going to be doing like certain neurological testings as well.
It might be really, really rigorous, but I can be really, really autistic sometimes. So I don't know. But I'm messing with you. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
But ADHD, that's fair.
What you're saying there too is also something that, like, I think I have experience with people will say something like, oh, like, I had a collection of symptoms and I started reading, and I realized that I have this particular thing. And then they'll even take that and go like, that's why I'm also going to stop trying to do this or this or this thing in life. Now I found out that there's even more things that I can't do well, or that I shouldn't even attempt to bother to try to do because I have this particular mental illness. Yeah, fuck. All of the conversations about it are actually so frustrating today. It's weird because like you have like these, you brought up this phrase earlier, and I totally pushed back against it so much 5 years ago because people would go too far. I don't like to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or like you are, you have to figure your own shit out. Like I think that's really toxic, but I definitely feel like we've gone too far in the other direction sometimes, where we've gone, like somebody might say something like, here's a statement, okay? There are absolutely things that you can do to improve your mental health, even if you have clinical depression. Things like getting healthier food, exercising, like having social events. Like these are absolutely things that you can do to improve your outcomes. But if you even suggest that, people will say like, oh, what? I just pull myself up by my bootstraps? Is that what you want me to do? It's like, no, wait. Like you can't even have conversations about improving your outcomes anymore because people just assume that it's like you're telling somebody that they can fix their depression with a particular thing. It's like, well, no, that's not what's being said,
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's this like, again, like I understand why the shift came, because like mental health was not dealt with well in our society, right? There really was like oh, you're sad?
Yeah.
Just don't be sad, right? And it's like, well, that's not fucking helpful to anyone, obviously.
For sure.
But now there's this converse of being like, okay, usually what I tell my clients is I'm like, just so you know, like this race against like mental health and getting you like happy and well and like functioning is really important. and I will put in as much effort as you put in, but I
Mm-hmm.
can't drag you across the finish line because it won't matter to,
Mm-hmm.
like, it won't be meaningful, right? So if you're putting in a ton of effort, I'm going to put in a ton of effort. But like, especially, I have to say this because I work also with like addiction clients, right? Which can be like really, really draining.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a worker, you can always do 30 times more than your client, particularly in the addiction field. But I think it's really, really important to remember, like, just because people want to come around and support you, and that's good, it doesn't mean that you should kind of like lay back and like expect people to carry you through. There's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely things that you can do, and I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, well, if you're depressed, just like eat better
Mm-hmm.
and you'll be fine. Like it's obviously not that simple, but why wouldn't you be trying it,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important thing to bring up, and I'm glad that at least on like Twitch and in this social media space, you're kind of like making space for that conversation to happen, because I think even like a year ago, um, like, as somebody in the field, it's intimidating to even try to talk about it because the backlash against you is like so hard.
Yeah, I
It's like you're
still
just like a
definitely
victim
have.
blamer and you're still like a terrible person, and it's just
Yeah.
like,
And that victim, not victim, but that like victim blaming complex, like it carries over into like every part of society, where to have any type of conversation, you have to like caveat, like even in this conversation with you, you've heard me like, I'm going to caveat this, I'm going to say that or whatever, because people get so mad. I remember that like like two other quick examples I can think of. When I was really poor, there were two big costs you can control in your life. One is your rent and one is your car payment. These are like the two biggest payments that any working class person has to deal with. And oftentimes, like if you were having issues like affording where you went, like the one of the biggest things you could do is like try to find a cheaper apartment. And I think that we were having a conversation about this. It was like, yeah, sometimes moving can be like the best way to, it's the biggest expense you have. And that whole conversation topic got boiled down to like, Destiny thinks poor people should just move and that'll fix their problems. Just move, just move. It's like, well, no, that's not true, right? That's an oversimplification of what I said. But even just like saying that would like make people like so upset in terms of like suggesting that you have some level of autonomy over yourself, like, is so upsetting to people.
yeah.
There was the Just Move thing, and there was there was another example having to do with like dating, I think, and somebody made a post about like should a woman, if you go over to a guy's house after a date, like, is it okay for the guy to expect sex or something? And I think that largely the answer is you should never expect sex. It's not, you should never pressure somebody like that. But I think the thing that I said was like, if you're willing to invite somebody over to your home, it was from the woman's side. If you're willing to invite somebody over to your home, then like sex is something that you should like be ready for, because that's going to be the expectation, whether it's like you have it or not. Like that's going to be what people are thinking of. And oh man, the amount of anger from that take too was also like, are you saying it's okay to rape women that invite you to their house? Like, Jesus Christ, no, that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and then all the mental stuff carries the exact same types of conversations.
Yeah, and it's just like, I don't know if it's worse on TikTok. I feel like TikTok and Twitter are kind of the same, but like, yeah, I talk a fair bit on my TikTok about like dating, because I'm really, really passionate about assertiveness training for women, because I think it's really,
Jordan Peterson.
I guess it is Jordan Peterson. I guess he does talk about assertiveness.
Because he works with women a lot. And he says one of the biggest issues with women is they're not assertive enough in the workplace when it comes to things like asking for raises and stuff. And that's a big issue why some of the pay gap might exist for sexism reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, which like, I wouldn't say like, is women not being assertive an issue? I would say no, unless they have certain goals that they want to achieve. Then yeah, you probably do need to. But assertiveness training more for me is about consent and sexuality. That's actually more what I'm focused on. But that might just be like my bias, because again, I just don't care that much about like climbing the ladder and like the financial rat race. Like, it's not something I'm super passionate about. And so I'm like, yeah, like if a woman wants to like do better in like a business setting, yeah, she probably should learn how to like negotiate wages and stuff a little bit better, particularly because like I would disagree with Jordan Peterson. I think there are definitely like spaces in the workplace that are absolutely like more biased towards women. I think like women, either you're going to glean a lot of respect as a woman like pretty quickly, or if you kind of like misspeak or you like look a little bit more like passive, you're going to get much more quickly kind of like thrown to the side and then ignored and not really respected for your opinion, right? I think that like kind of more implicit bias still exists within the workplace, which is why absolutely women, especially if they've been in that position where they're more agreeable, they're not as likely to speak up for themselves, they can absolutely benefit from learning how to speak up for themselves. And the reality is their life quality will probably somewhat improve because they'll get more of the things that they want and need. But for sexuality specifically, I think it's actually really, really important to like normalize like normalize women approaching men, I think is like a really big thing that I'm passionate about, because then you can set the terms of the negotiation, and you can make it safer for yourself as a woman, right? Because
For
I
sure.
think like there's absolutely like concerns about like domestic violence and even just like sexual assault and stuff like that. Like there's very legitimate safety concerns that women have. And if we normalize women approaching more often, they have a better space to, right? They can choose where they're approaching men. So rather than being approached in like a dark at night while they're like waiting at a bus stop and they don't really have anywhere to go because they can't miss their bus, they can choose to approach somebody in a grocery store, right? And have a better interaction there. That doesn't obviously help them in the bus stop situation, but if cultural norms shift a little bit, we might start seeing less of that behavior.
For sure.
Because men are going to get more used to being approached by women, right? But a lot of women are too uncomfortable. They're nervous about rejections. They think people are going to think they're weird, which is something I think actually just like basic assertiveness training could really help with.
Yeah, for sure.
Same with like consent, right? Like if you're a woman, you want to bring a guy back to your house, but you don't want to have sex, like just say that, right? Just figure out like how I kind of call it like palatable assertiveness, because there's a lot of like women empowerment stuff that like basically encourages women to just be like super mean.
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, but you have to realize, right? Like if you're in a situation where you're worried about your safety, being super mean in that situation is not likely to
Produce a good
safer.
outcome. Yeah.
It's going to potentially escalate things and make it more dangerous for you. And this isn't about like worrying about the other person's feelings necessarily, which I don't think is nothing, right? Like it would be nice if like we could reject men more nicely sometimes. But it's really fundamentally in large part about the safety of women, of saying like, hey, how do we palatably be assertive? How do you palatably say like, hey, no, I'm just not interested, but not be super like terrible about it, right? Like
this is
that's kind of what I talk about when I'm saying assertiveness training, just because it's actually a really, really broad field of therapy.
For sure. One thing that is a little bit irritating sometimes is that like there are definitely a lot of negative social things that exist regarding women. That was an incredibly vague statement. But it's frustrating because like almost every negative like socio like gender dynamic that exists, it's usually reinforced by both sides, but having that conversation is very, very, very hard, because it almost always immediately comes across as being like victim blamey or something like that, and then people get like very upset about like suggesting that like, well, maybe the standard can change on the other side as well, you know, like maybe it's not just men that need to change. Maybe women can also change in some way too to alleviate this. But like that conversation is very hard to have. So one thing I talk about in terms of like men having like a lot of kind of like rapey behavior and that being really normalized, that's a problem and it shouldn't happen and it's really horrible. But if you have a society where men are constantly expected to make the first move, and sometimes women are even expected to say no more than they'd like to, I mean, what do you expect? But besides creating a society where men are, you know, maybe more likely to push too far sometimes, like that's just going to happen, of course, as they try to figure out like where the boundary is, right? So that's like a gender norm that could be fixed on with pushing on both sides, you know?
Yeah, even like I was watching Yellowstone last night, and there's this idea that a lot of like some of my followers have brought up that like I'm not super exposed to, but like I've always been a pretty like decently disagreeable, like straight shooting woman. And so they talk about this idea of like a lot of women say like the reason why I didn't date you or didn't say yes to you is because you didn't try hard enough. Like you should have pursued me harder, right? Which is it's a really bad idea. I get it from like the romantic end. Like I don't want to totally destroy romanticism and like say like there's no space for like kind of that tension and excitement.
For sure.
But in a culture where like so much sexual assault is being brought out, there's lots of concerns around like consent and like safety in these engagements, in large part because of our like sexual emancipation in the 60s. Like the terms of sexual engagement between the sexes really changed, right? And women now have birth control, and so like as the landscape has changed, obviously our social norms have to change. And I would totally agree, we're kind of like in this midway where like there's certain traditional values that are still kind of occupied by both sexes and genders, and then there's also these really like modern values that we're occupying, but sometimes these are mutually exclusive ideas, right? And so like even yesterday I saw in like Yellowstone, like this woman being like, well, are you gonna like kiss me? And like he was like, oh, like I think she didn't even say, well, are you gonna kiss me? She turns like, she's like, well, you're in a bad situation. Hey, if you kiss me right now and I don't want it, you're being predatory. But if I want it and you don't kiss me, like basically like you're kind of being like, I think the implication was like, yeah, you're kind of being like But I think more than that, not just squandering opportunity, but like kind of being like a weak male,
Oh,
right?
sure. You're not fulfilling your role as like a masculine figure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're not pursuing me hard enough. And it's
Yeah.
just like, okay,
Another really big example of this dynamic in society is that women are being empowered more and more to pursue higher education, which they're now
yeah,
exceeding men by a scary amount. By what I would say is probably a
yes.
not good amount now. In the United States, I think it's 60% of newly graduating people are women, which that's a scary tip. But women still, the last survey stuff that I saw, women still are generally not as willing to date down socioeconomically. So while women have taken on more roles that were traditionally masculine, so working certain jobs and earning a lot of money, being the breadwinners, men aren't allowed to step into what were traditionally more feminine roles, like being a home or caretaker, because that's like a loser position that a man shouldn't work, you know? So it's interesting that like, yeah, that balancing that dynamic out is very difficult.
It's so difficult, right? And the problem is that nobody's very good at saying what they actually want, right? There's a lot of women who will say, well, I want like a really highly vulnerable man. And then there's so many men who are like, yeah, I get really vulnerable and sensitive and I like tell them what I'm insecure about. And then she like immediately becomes like pretty unattracted to me, right? And I'm just
Uh-huh.
like, okay, first of all, I don't have that experience. I've never done that myself. So I'm like, I don't know if this is broadly true or if this is just people who are like bitter saying that this is true, right? Like obviously like as you as a man who's dated women can probably report better about that experience, but it's like that if that's true, then that means that women are saying that they want highly vulnerable men, but they don't entirely. They want men who will be emotionally supportive to them, but they don't necessarily want to support them. And I don't think that that's all or most women. I guess I'd be curious on your thoughts on that as somebody who's just dated women.
I think that
Do you,
it's another difficult thing where, and I say this sometimes and it sounds really mean. Well, no, this applies to men and women. It's very hard to pull somebody and get an honest thing of like what they might want for like dating related stuff. That can be very misrepresented sometimes, I think, right? Where I did not mean to do that. Where like if you were to pull, this is just a guess, okay? I'll do this for both sides. If you were to poll men and say, is a woman being quite a bit younger than you a massive plus without outweigh a lot of other things, I think that the true answer to that is going to be much higher than what men might put on a poll. They're like, well, nah, is a woman age that important? Like, nah, I don't think so, right? But then like a 22-year-old comes along and is like, oh, is she negative in like every other area of my life? Sure, right? Or then same thing on the flip side for women, like, is a man being incredibly wealthy, is that really that important? Women be like, no, of course not. I would never go after a man just because he's wealthy. But then like in the real life, like, like I think that it's hard to poll around issues like that. I think it gets very complicated very quickly because how people act in real life might not coincide with how they would like idealistically answer a poll about their own behavior or desires, you know? And then even when it comes time for certain things, like I want a man that's more, to your example, like emotionally vulnerable, do they really mean that? Or is that like a thing where they say they want somebody that's emotionally vulnerable, but what they really want is somebody that like will only cry when like their whole family dies, and then otherwise they're just like a very supportive person and maybe they have the capacity for it? Like, do you really want, this sounds very, I'm not trying to sound sexist, but like, do you really want a man that is willing to cry as much as like a woman might have traditionally? Like, I think a lot of women would probably be turned off by that in certain situations, even if they say otherwise. So it's a hard thing to navigate, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something honestly like in my own relationship with my partner, I've had to navigate. And I always hate saying this because everyone is going to call me a pick me immediately, which is absolutely not what I am. But there's definitely an issue that I've struggled with in my relationship where like I am definitely I identify as a woman and all these things, but I occupy a lot of more like traditionally masculine personality traits. Now I very much apply to more of like a gender. I don't love the rigidity of gender roles or anything like that, which is why um I'm just giving the caveats, I guess.
Sure.
But my husband identifies as a man, but he occupies again a number of more feminine personality traits. And I realized that I was doing this thing that I think a lot of women do, where when he like emotionally needed certain supports, I was willing to give it. But if I also felt emotional, so say he brought something to me that upset me and he was feeling really hurt, but what he brought to me hurt my feelings, I think I had this implicit kind of bias of being like, well, my feelings are always going to be number one priority because they're like bigger. I think and I've talked with a lot of women who are like, actually, I think that that's kind of true. And it's definitely not like an explicit thing, right? It's a very much like an implicit bias of being like, I get that you're hurt, but like I'm hurting right now. And there's kind of like that implicit, like, and I'm the woman in the relationship,
yeah.
right? So like my feelings, can't we get to my feelings first? And he's like, what do you mean? Like I brought my feelings up first. Like why would we get to your feelings first, right?
Yeah.
And as we were working through a relationship, it was a really big area that I really hurt him in. And so I had to actually work hard on like challenging myself. And literally what I would do is I'd be like, he would say something to me that maybe like upset me. And then I'd be like, wait, if this was like your best friend who is another woman, how would you feel about it? And I'm like, oh, I could totally make space for her feelings first and then also voice my feelings after. Like it wouldn't even be a question to me. And I was like, okay, if that's the case, you obviously have an implicit bias here and you need to like make space for his feelings. There's no reason not to, in large part because what I want in my relationship is a much more egalitarian relationship, right? And I think there's just not, I don't think there's like a social consciousness of this like dynamic happening. And so there's, again, you have these things where people are saying what they want. I want an emotionally vulnerable man, but they're not actually saying what they actually want, which is I want you to be emotionally supportive to me. I don't really want you to cry as much as like I do, though.
Yeah.
I don't really want that, right?
That sounds really bad to say, though,
terrible.
but yeah. I think that something that I have a talk with somebody else right after our talk, actually, and we talked about this last time, so it's funny that you bring this up. Something that I think people run into that is an issue is when we talk about like deconstructing kind of these like roles that exist in society, like why do men act the way they do? Why do women act the way they do? Can we take away these things? I think that there's a lot of value in kind of deconstructing those, but I think that it's very important to understand why they existed in the first place. So when people like to act like, oh, you know, men and women are totally interchangeable, nothing matters, there's no difference between the two or whatever, it's like, okay, I understand the desire for that, but like, there's probably a reason why some things have existed. And it might be the case that in some reasons, the reason why was just because people were assholes and they were losers and there's no good reason for it, right?
Yeah.
But it might also be the case that they existed for, you know, maybe like a much better reason. Maybe there was like a real reason why these things, maybe women do tend a certain way or men do tend a certain way. Like that's totally possible, you know, that's believable.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of this quote, which is basically like, question tradition but distrust the obvious, right?
Sure.
And so it's like you absolutely, as like Nietzsche would even agree on, like you absolutely should look at all of the assumptions that our culture have made, traditional gender roles, all these things, and you should absolutely question them and be like, is there validity here? And like kind of deconstruct it and be like, what have these roles offered? Okay, well, a lot of part of these roles absolutely relied on the fact that like women had no way to control whether or not they got pregnant with sex, right? Which is part of why monogamous marriage became such an important thing in our culture because it actually protected women a little bit more, right? And like, that's why that happened. But now in our culture, that principle basically isn't at play. So how do our relationships need to change to accommodate a new like factual landscape that we exist on, basically, right? And so I think it's a really important thing that basically you're like bringing up here, being like, what are we inheriting that is valuable? What was the purpose to it? And like before we just like do away with all traditional like values and all these things, let's try to analyze what their worth is. And if there isn't any worth, that's fine.
Then toss it,
right? We can toss it, but you don't want to toss babies out with the bathwater. And I think that's what we tend to do in the name of progress is we're like, well, there's a lot of really harmful things that came with really traditional gender roles. Absolutely. Like domestic violence was a massive issue, right? The fact that like there was like the Hyde's Law in the UK until like 1993, where like it wasn't technically rape if a man like raped his wife, right?
Yeah, 'cause you can't rape your wife,
obviously,
right?
those are fucking terrible things, right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we've done away with them. But, you know, there's a lot of women that I've talked to that are older that they've kind of been sold this idea by like modernity that like a woman should really want career first and then maybe later she'll get a husband. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, you've dramatically limited the pool because, as you said, most women tend, I find, not to want to date down educationally. They often want men similar educated, but as you said, 60% of people getting degrees are women. So you have already a smaller pool of men to select from, right? A lot of women are like pursuing all these things. They're having struggles potentially with fertility issues because they're getting pregnant a lot later and getting married and then getting pregnant a lot later. And so I've run into a lot of like women in their like 30s and 30s to 40s who are like, man, I feel like I was fed a fucking lie. Or like I've got like 6 degrees on my wall.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm 40 and I'm like, fuck, I just want a family. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, that's okay too. Like people can actually want very traditional, simple things like
Mm-hmm.
a family. Like there's nothing wrong with just wanting to be. I know lots of women who are like, I actually kind of just want to be a stay-at-home mom. And I'm like, well, with inflation, it's unlikely, but like, that's a fair thing to want to have. And it feels like we've kind of tossed the baby out the bathwater and like not made space. Like I wish as we were doing this like gender role reduction, which I'm actually broadly in favor for,
Mm-hmm.
because it benefits somebody like me, right?
Yeah.
I worry about us actually. What we've done is we've almost just made new rigid boxes
Yeah.
instead.
And that, like, I think that, like, it was supposed to be the way that it always presented to me, the way that I always argued at others is that, like, when we talk about eliminating gender roles, the point wasn't to make it so that you were shamed for doing traditional stuff. It was that you had an option not to. Like, that's all it meant.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you didn't want to be like a stay-at-home mom, that's fine. You don't have to be. You're not going to be forced to. But if you make it so that now people are like shamed for being stay-at-home moms, like, okay, well now we've just kind of like moved in the opposite direction,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think you and I are going to disagree
Probably on
like
any of these things, yeah.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, like, here's the problem with you, Destiny, is you're just so damn consistent. It's hard to disagree with you on many things, right? So,
True. Absolutely.
which is actually like refreshing, but probably also not something that I should like expect in all spaces. Is there anything on like dating or psychology that you think would be interesting to talk about or bring up?
I don't know. This is I'm not trying to drag myself up, but like I guess the boring thing is that like I like to have conversations with more educated people. But most of the opinions I think that I have, I like to assume that like I'm usually like, well, what does the research say about this thing, or what do like educated people say? So there's not usually much like area for disagreement. So usually we come on and then we kind of circle jerk, and then I go back into the sludge that is online conversation. I guess usually something that I'll ask is like, have you heard me say something I guess you disagree with me a lot about? And then we can move from there, I guess. Do you feel like when I've mentioned anything related to psychology or any of these topics that I've been like super off or wrong about a particular thing, or...
DID, that's one that I think we might differ on.
Okay.
Because I think I'm not sure, I guess, what is your view on DID? And just to clarify for viewers who don't know, that means dissociative identity disorder, or people who feel like they have multiple personalities that they switch between.
The way that it's described, I think, is total bullshit. There might be like a world where, I think the last person I talked to tried to say this. So like there might be a world where like I understand what people say, or hold on. Somebody was trying to describe DID before as like we can have trauma in our childhood that makes us act in different ways in different situations. Like when you get rid of like the really sexy interpretation of like the multiple personalities that I can see, maybe there's something called DID. But in terms of like how it's often talked about or portrayed, I think it's just total horseshit.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely become just like sexy and cool.
Mm-hmm.
I would be, so there's a really big split in academic psychology about DID.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely people who are like, there is no question that there are rare individuals with these multiple personalities that they actually do like switch between and have different consciousnesses like operating at different times. And then there's other people who'd be like, absolutely not, this is horseshit. This is just like an extreme form of things that we all do, which is like, of course you're going to be a little bit different with like your grandma or when you go to work, right? And so there's kind of people being like, there's kind of these two camps. Unlike I think a lot, I'm actually, this is probably one area where I'm like much more like radical in, which is compared to like, I have a lot of like OG psychological takes, but DID is something I'm actually very in favor of broadly, not the way it's portrayed on social media because it's just like really glamorized. I think there's absolutely a lot of people who like benefit from faking it, and it's really destructive. The problem is that like people don't realize like when you fake it and like claim these things and you don't have it, you absolutely destroy the legitimate suffering and like experience of people who actually are suffering with this on a day-to-day, right? It's the problem why when you're like people are like, oh, I'm just being like so ADHD, and I'm like, okay, but like, or like ADHD is like my superpower, and I'm like, I'm glad that it is for you, but for most people who experience it, it's really, really frustrating. So like let's be careful about how we're characterizing this and not like dismissing the legitimacy.
Sure.
I can send you some articles that I would say to me are what strongly convinced me. So I will admit I'm probably biased towards DID because my undergrad supervisor that I did my undergrad thesis under, he was actually like a pretty central DID researcher in Canada before he switched into research pure. He worked at basically our mental hospitals, like severe mental hospitals, for 30 plus years before he moved into research. And what moved him into research was DID because he did have a client with DID. So it's super, super rare, like super, super rare, because it requires, what we do believe is it requires immense amounts of trauma. And probably something else, but really it's rare enough that most of the research we have it is actually case studies because we don't even have a big enough population of them to do like quantitative analysis on. So you can't like talk about their genetics or like is there this biological influence because you just have these individuals, which is why when I see like so many people on social media having it, I'm very dubious, right? As soon as the prevalence on social media doesn't really seem to match, I'm like, it's possible that the reason why they're blowing up on social media is because it's so sensational, so maybe it does match. It's like kind of that selection bias of like what bleeds leads, right? So it might just be that. But I'll maybe post some articles in your because I think, is your Discord still messed up? I'll just post it in your chat.
Even if the Discord is messed up, it'll probably work after a while. Test. No, it's working now. Should be good.
Okay, I'll send it there. I'll post it there, and I'll also send it to you on Discord then, so you have it on hand whenever you'd like to look at it on your own. Oh, my Discord's now broken on my computer, so I won't send it there. Sorry. So this one is really, the first one I send is a really interesting article. So it's basically, they would argue it is documented objective evidence of DID. So it was in a number of individuals who are incarcerated. And so the beauty of studying incarcerated individuals, which I like, want a caveat of being like, obviously it's not beautiful, they're incarcerated, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, is that you get so much data on them, right? The tricky thing with like any form of therapy is that you are only at the mercy of what your client wants to tell you. Right. So you
they
can
might have
a
other
client,
things in their life that are fucking with them. Their diet might get super fucked. Their sleep might get super fucked. They might have adverse events, stressful. Yeah, but in a prison environment, a lot of that is more controlled. It's as close as you can get to that person in a vat study as you possibly can get.
Yeah, and a lot of people lie about the bad things that they do, right? So like, I was working with a client for a super long time who was like, I just don't understand why my kids don't want to be in relationship with me. And it literally took me working with this client for 8 months before I found out, oh, she really aggressively physically abused her children for a long time, right? And it's like, how did this not come up sooner, right? Like, it's not, and I understand why, right? It's a shame, but it's like as a this is why I actually almost never really like to do one-on-one counseling. I'm very pro group therapy because that shit comes out real quick in group therapy. Like their weird social dynamics, or they're like, everyone's just really mean to me. And then you like watch them in group therapy and they're just like actually like really condescending to everyone they talk to. And I'm like, well, yeah, people are being mean to you, but like you're instigating it a lot of time. Like you're treating people like they're stupid. Anyways, that's a side tangent. I'm just very pro group therapy, and a lot of people I've noticed never talk about group therapy. But it's actually, I would argue, like better in almost all circumstances, excluding again like severe cases like DID. I wouldn't put an individual with DID in group therapy for obvious reasons. I think it's kind of group therapy with a DID person, I guess, to some extent.
Well, easiest way to double the size of your group, right? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But, okay.
Yeah. My sample size, yeah. Okay, so in this article that I sent you, 11 out of the 12 individuals had documented cases of extreme childhood abuse. And now when a social worker lists something as extreme childhood abuse, we're talking probably intentionally malicious, maybe even torturous levels of childhood abuse. Like really, really, really terrible shit, right? And most of these, all of the individuals that had this reported childhood abuse also had amnesic experiences of abuse. So the abuse was documented, it was verified, they had photos of the injuries, the social worker, like basically like the government came in and was like, absolutely there's abuse going on here. And most of the individuals didn't remember it, which actually happens a lot more often than people realize. And I hate to popularize that because amnesic experiences with abuse now it just gets like abused as well.
Sure. I'll drill down into this because I don't believe this is real. So maybe you can convince me, right? So I think that there are two ways that something isn't properly codified into long-term memory and can be accessed. One is if an injury is present, especially like a head injury, obviously. And then the second would be if a drug is present that inhibits that function for some reason. Sans those two things, if neither of those conditions are met, and we're talking about like a repressed memory, I feel like you can have a repressed memory where like something is maybe painful or cringy or irritating, and so you intentionally like don't think about it, and you just like, I'm just not gonna think about it, and then maybe over a long period of time you genuinely do forget about it. I would believe that as being a phenomenon, but the idea that like you can have an adverse like event and then you just like you don't remember that at all because it was so traumatic seems to be exactly contrary to everything that we understand about traumatic events, that these are usually codified like in the most extreme manner to memory, that you can have like triggers related to things that are even remotely resembling any of that sensory data, any of that stimulus, like people with like triggers, like actual triggers like PTSD and stuff. Why? Yeah, can you break that apart for me? That's where I like my mind is at, I guess, in terms of like repressed memories and stuff.
Yeah, and that's a really valid critique, and that's why I'm glad you bring it up, because it allows me to flesh this out, because absolutely amnesic experiences of abuse definitely get used. People overclaim it. There are absolutely cases of individuals creating false memories based on this, so that can absolutely happen. I guess the main thing I would point out, I don't have it on my like list because I didn't expect us to go in this direction necessarily, but I read a paper like 2 weeks ago about this that was showing that in cases of children, so part of you have to understand, it seems to be the case that trauma seems to do two things to memory. It either heightens it or it diminishes it, depending on basically probably a lot of things, probably in part personality, probably in part your age, likely in part, like the problem with trauma is it's so complex, and we have such like low resolution conversations about trauma where we're just like, all trauma is the same, because we don't want to invalidate people's experiences, but it's like obviously not all traumas are the same, because there's a really big difference between like getting in a car crash, waking up and seeing like your decapitated parent or something like that, versus like just getting in a car crash. Like those are obviously different experiences. It doesn't mean that your experience with the car crash wasn't terrible, especially for your lived experience is probably the worst thing that's maybe ever happened to you.
And even the resiliency of an individual might interpret how negative a trauma can like affect a person too. A highly resilient person, maybe not as much, or other.
Totally.
It's complicated, very complicated.
Yeah, we know that people's tendency for sensitivity for stimulation varies, right? There are some people that actually are just more sensitive to stimulation. They tend often to be more introverts, where they get overstimulated. We can actually test this pretty young from babies, and it's decently predictive, even just with baby tests of like, you just expose them to kind of a novel stimuli, and if they smile and engage, it is pretty predictive of how they're going to respond later in life to being extroverted versus introverted. But it's also decent as in I'm saying like probably like a 0.3 for people who are like into like probabilities and stats, right? Probably like a 0.3 of predicting whether or not they'll also like respond better or worse to more distressing environments, whether those distressing things are going to cause them to develop a mental health problem or not, right?
Wait, so can I ask one question related to that? I hope this is different. Is it known that there are reliable ways to develop resiliency in children?
Yes. There are ways to develop resiliency. Are you wanting me to go through them as well?
Yeah, like what are like the top one or two? Is it just gonna be like having a secure, loving relationship with a parent? Or
Yeah, they're disappointing because it's one of these things of like, sometimes when people are like, what's the mental health trick? And I'm like, you probably already know it, right? Having a really solid social thing. But a really big one that I think a lot of people who are parenting right now don't know about is it's really, really important to give your children what we call like manageable stress. So if you say your little toddler is building like a tower and you're watching it and you know the next block they're going to put on is going to fucking topple that shit. You know it. And you step in and you fix it so it doesn't topple. And I would argue to some extent, you're actually protecting them from a healthy, manageable stress that they could overcome, right? It's going to topple. They're going to get upset. They're going to cry. And then be like, hey, buddy, it's okay. Let's rebuild it. Like, maybe let's not put our block there. It's in an instructing moment, like, how do you actually overcome this stressor? So that is probably one main thing that any parent can do that absolutely is going to teach, because what it cultivates is something actually that I'm passionate about, because I've done my thesis was on this, which is called growth mindsets, which I would say growth mindsets is probably one of the most fundamental, like non-conscious system that's probably contributing to like resilience and grit and all these kind of terms, which is basically, if you come across a problem, do you believe I'm stuck as I am, there's nothing I can do to improve, so I may as well like roll over and die at this problem? Or do you think, hey, this trait that I have, whatever it is, my ability to build towers is probably changeable. I can probably improve it over time. So how do I do that, right? So I'm really passionate about growth mindsets because I think it's fundamental, and it's not super hard to cultivate. My research was on social anxiety and just convincing some students that were kind of self-identified as like highly shy and anxious around like social settings, to just basically believe that they could change their social anxiety, because a lot of people actually who have like mental health problems get very fixed, where they're like, I'm depressed and there's not much I can do about it. I am an anxious person and there's not much I can do about it. Like, that's my baseline. And it's like, actually those things are pretty changeable. You can absolutely improve them. So regarding resilience, I'd say the best thing you can do in your kid is cultivate a growth mindset and allow them to experience manageable stressors, right? If they lose a race, it's fine. You should be happy that they lost the race, because they're going to be bummed, but it's good for them because that's a manageable stress, right? Things like chronic aggressive bullying, I wouldn't say is like manageable stress for a lot of kids. Those are situations where I'm like, yeah, you probably should move your kid away from that school, because sometimes bullying just clears up by just giving them a new social setting, and then suddenly they're like a big fish in that school. But yeah, you definitely want them to like undergo certain stressors, allow them to fail, and then your job as the parent is to come in alongside and say, how do we approach this again and overcome it this time? How can we problem solve, right? That's really good for resilience.
Okay, gotcha. I had a friend a while ago that recommended a book that I never read because I'm too lazy, but it was interesting, and it kind of goes along with this. Conventionally, we're kind of taught that stress is like really, really, really negative. Like physiologically, it has a lot of negative effects on the body. And I think that this book went on to make the argument that there's two types of stress, basically. Stress where we feel hopeless is horrible for us. It's incredibly bad physiologically. But stress that we feel like we can manage can be a good experience. And that was interesting because like I've had a lot of stress in my life for a lot of different reasons, and but I always feel like I have a lot of agency, and I like those environments where they're very stressful. It makes me feel really good, and I've always wondered sometimes, like, am I gonna have a lot of negative, like, is the cortisol destroying my heart or something? And like, I don't, my mental seems to be pretty high, and then understanding that concept, kind of like, oh, okay, maybe this makes more sense. Like, I felt like there's been a lot of areas where I've had a lot of stress, but I've never felt like I don't have any control over what I can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually like an excellent TED Talk that's pretty old now, and there's some nuance missing because she doesn't really get into like, she kind of tries to just be like, all stress is good, and it's like, well, there's definitely like, again, like PTSD stress is not really good for anyone, right? Like being kidnapped and tortured. Nobody really walks away being like, that was dope, and I feel like refreshed, right? Like that's not the experience. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's called Stress is Your Friend. Maybe somebody will come up with it in the TED Talk. It's not like one of the TEDx. Yeah, How to Make Stress Your Friend by Kelly McGonigal. It's a really good video. It's old. Like I said, there's missing some nuance, so don't like get like super angry right away. If you're like, oh, this isn't true. I know you're probably not going to, but I'm posting it in my chat and yours, so people can check it out. But there's actually some evidence that shows actually that if you come across manageable stress and you can kind of have a like, I can overcome this, I can manage this. This is kind of like, you kind of have like a bit of like a stoic, like amor fati response of like, I love this. This is meaningful to me. It's growing me as an individual. It's actually healthier for your heart. There's definitely, in this TED Talk, she goes through evidence of being people who died most often from stress related causes were people who also believed that stress was really bad for them. So again, this is where I get the nuance of being like, okay, well, obviously some stresses just aren't great and nobody's going to think that it's good for them.
For sure.
Like traumatic things, but kind of what you're talking about, right? Of like this Twitch debate space where there's just drama all the time and people are fighting, and like you're in a debate and people are like grilling you on stuff, and the fact that like you enjoy it, like I think that that's actually a mindset, probably in part that you're probably predilected towards, but also you could cultivate. And I would argue it's probably healthier for everyone because your heart can either beat really fast and prepare you for dealing with the situation, or you can say, my heart's beating really fast. I'm filled with anxiety. Oh no,
Yeah.
I'm doomed, right?
Sure.
And the way your body responds to that stress is different. And in fact, I think in her video, she even talks about how like cortisol levels drop a fair bit. When you have a healthier response to stress, it triggers you to be like more relational and engaged with others. You could try to reach out. You might engage in more physical forms of touching as well, which is great for like oxytocin. And those things are actually good for heart health. But again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not like specialized in neurotransmitters in the rest of the body. I'm much more like trained in just the brain. So yeah, I would just check that out. I think it's a really interesting take because I think like we definitely need to have a more complex view of stress because we've definitely been villainizing stress really hard, which is why we try to prevent our kids. Like, I don't want anything bad to ever happen to my kid. And I'm like, I mean, I don't either, but I recognize it will, and I really want to make sure my kid is prepared for that. Right?
Yeah, I think the way that I normally talk about this is it seems like we've demonized all forms of challenging experiences, and some challenging experiences are definitely important to development. Yeah,
they're super important.
Okay, I super pulled you off the DID thing. Go ahead.
That's okay. Okay, going back, I think I was telling you about the paper. I was talking about amnesia. So there was another paper that came out just because you were dubious about amnesia. Okay, so yeah, trauma seems to do. Right, we got onto this because I was talking about highly sensitive children versus non-highly sensitive. Another marker might be something like neuroticism, which is a terrible word because lay people use it to mean
Neurotic
like crazy.
is bad, yeah.
Yeah, whereas in like psychology, personality psych, it just means your tendency to feel negative emotions more strongly. Like it's just like a pretty like basic metric, and people vary high and low. The main thing to I guess to like. Where am I going with this with DID?
People that are high in
neuroticism
neuroticism maybe are more prone to childhood traumas, or what were you were talking about childhood trauma?
in part, right? Because they're feeling it more intensely than you might be. Their negative emotions are more strong. But it seems to be the case that people respond to trauma differently, and particularly children. This is actually why the diagnosis of childhood trauma is really difficult because so an event might happen to a child, like trying to think of like TOS safe words to say that are like traumatic.
You can say anything as long as you're not being ridiculous.
Okay.
But like
so,
a childhood like sexual rape or something.
assault.
Yeah, sexual assault. Yeah.
Right. And so like it might have been as like severe as like a form of like grooming and rape that happens to this child for multiple years, right? If we think about that, we think about PTSD because if that happened, even if it's just one instance, okay, we're going to just use one instance of a sexual assault, right? If that happened to an adult individual, there's a decent chance they could develop PTSD, right? There's actually other things that they can develop as well. They can just develop depression. Some of them just kind of grieve and then kind of bounce back, and then some of them experience something called PTG, post-traumatic growth. But that's kind of what we expect with adults. The problem is that children are kind of weird. Sometimes they'll develop PTSD, especially if they're old enough or it's severe enough. But children, especially if the person who is harming them is also their caregiver, their system is highly motivated to manage functioning and staying close to that caregiver, even if their caregiver is because we have these two systems, which is behavioral approach system. They're very, very deep old systems. Mammals, lizards even have them, which is that things that reward us, we tend to approach again. Things that harm us, we tend to avoid. Really basic phenomenon. But if you're a child, if your parent is the thing that harms you, your system in part is going to want to behaviorally avoid, but they also are your caretaker and you're also biologically driven to draw towards them because they provide you food, safety, comfort, all those things, right? And so you kind of have these two conflicting systems. And what it seems to do in a lot of children is they go, well, this person is really hurting me, but I also really need them. And so like basically like your brain might, as a survival mechanism, be like, let's dial down the importance or even the memory of this harm so that we can manage staying close and our behavioral avoidance system doesn't overtake us. So we can continue to approach parent and be connected and desire like connection with them and do all the things that facilitate relational connection. It's why it creates such like major attachment issues as they grow older, right? Where they're like, oh, I don't have like PTSD as reactions. Like I'm not having necessarily flashbacks, but it's like every time I notice somebody like pulling away from me, I panic, right? And that's like, it's we can't really call it PTSD because PTSD is a very like unique experience. It's more like this unhealthy form of like coping that develops as a result. And so one way that children with really severe abuse, particularly by their parents, can cope is to shut down those memories. And your brain can go, we're not going to consolidate this. It's not super helpful to our functioning. The problem is that it gets kind of consolidated and then it gets kind of stored away. We're not entirely sure how. We're not sure if it gets consolidated as just like a somatic memory, that and like the episodic cues of it don't get like, because there's the problem with memory is also actually like there's like 6 forms of memory systems. I think 6 is probably an overstatement. I think it's maybe 4. But there's multiple memory systems, right? And so it's like, yeah, you don't explicitly remember, but that doesn't mean that there's kind of like a famous book. There's kind of the pop culture one by Bessel van der Kolk, but there was actually the original one by Babette Rothschild, which was like a research heavy book, basically about how the body remembers. And so there was a study that came out that showed of children who had experienced documented, reported abuse, 50% of them didn't remember it. Like 50% of them were shocked to find out and like were shown evidence of their abuse and were like literally like shocked, like, I don't remember this. Are you sure that this is real? Whereas we see those amnesic experiences once trauma is happening later in life really jump down. So it really does seem to be some sort of kind of unique system that's happening for children to protect them and keep them basically able to survive in connection to their harming parent.
Yeah. So something that I'm always fearful of is I'm sure have you ever heard of the concept of a just so story?
I don't think so, actually.
So something that is a little scary to me about like evolutionary psychology is that it's hard to test like why, like we can't really know why a thing happens, right? Like we might have like the body does this because of this, but we don't really know. It could be a byproduct of something. It could be because of a totally different reason, or it could be a malfunction, right? I understand that there are explanations for why maybe something should happen, but it seems hard without something else to test it to know why a certain thing happens. But I will say that, so the explanation you've given me seems like plausible, I guess. The interesting thing, though, I would be interested if you could link me later or whatever, that study where it shows that like 50% of children with documented trauma don't recall it. That's interesting to me. That would be like a strong indicator that would point towards, oh, well, maybe there is like some sort of amnesia event that's happening here. And then that in conjunction with the explanation of like, well, your early caregiver is really important, so maybe it makes sense that the body is trying to find a way to interfere with that if that early caregiver is not fulfilling their correct role. It sounds, pretty compelling. I would be interested to see that if you can shoot me that at some point.
Absolutely. I'll write it down just so I'm not like distracted looking for it while we continue to talk.
The only another really big thing why I think that's important, the verified part, is because I know that there was a time period where psychologists, unfortunately, we're creating so the verified part is important, but you every time you mention, I think you're aware of this because you keep saying that like people took pictures and it was like 100% verified. It wasn't just like the social worker saying something has happened. And that's why that's exactly why I'm bringing verified up, is because there was a period where there was this issue where we started realizing that these fugues happened, and so all these, again, it's these like sometimes things with the best intentions are like lead to like the worst outcomes, right? So these well-intending therapists, again, who are like not always the most empirical or not the most empirically careful, were like, oh, that makes so much sense for so many of my clients. And so they started digging and being like, well, is it possible? And they would have these like leading questions, and they weren't doing it because they're like, I want to have my clients have all trauma. They were trying to offer it as a solution of being like, maybe this is why you're struggling so much, right? They were genuinely trying to help, but what happened is that there was a lot of cases of legitimately falsified and false memories formed. And it's actually part of, because there was a really interesting study that came out of UBC by a master's student that proved unequivocally that within like 6 months, it's not that hard to create very, very complex false memories. It's actually why eyewitness testimony, she did it in regard to eyewitness testimony, because there's a big movement within at least like judicial areas in Canada to just more or less remove eyewitness accounts if they haven't been recorded within 24 hours of the event happening, because of the memory system's erosion over time. Seems to be pretty quick. And not even, I think I would even phrase it a little bit more strongly. It's not even so much the memory system's erosion, is that I think that, especially with the advent of computers, it feels like we have a pretty bad way of understanding how we recall events and everything. We seem to think that we kind of like create these memories in our brain as like these kind of like bit perfect copies of like, well, this is a picture of that and we remember the sound, when you're kind of like more actively involved in recreating a memory every time you bring it up and like lacking some details. I thought the way they explained it in Inception was interesting, that like in a dream, you know, you only have to create certain parts and then the mind will fill in the rest. And that is absolutely true, that only given some details, your mind can fill in a lot of extra information that was not there initially. But it just seems
Doing
like
it right now as you're awake.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, like, yeah, I mean, yeah, because you don't have the perception right now that you can't see things in your peripheral vision, but your resolution there is very, very, very poor. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you see everything like exactly as you're supposed to. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen like the YouTube video where they have you count the volleyball as they pass the ball in between themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the gorilla in the center, right? That's just a good demonstration of like, in fairness, like people who are more likely to potentially be like ADHD tend to fail that test. They tend to see the gorilla right away. Mm-hmm. But in general, it's a show of like when you highly attend to things, you absolutely exclude like major things like a monkey dancing in the middle. And it was like upwards of 60% of participants who had that gorilla test didn't see the gorilla, right?
Yeah.
So absolutely, like that's why eyewitness testimony is like so careful. Like, well, did they have a blue hat or a black hat? And it's like they probably didn't even
have a hat or something, or
they didn't even notice when they were looking at the guy, let alone 24 hours later, let alone 2 weeks later, right? Like what's the likelihood that they remember?
And something that is so frustrating to me, I took an AP Psych class one time, and it's probably the best class I've ever taken in my life. There's so many interesting things about like human memory and cognition, whatever. Everything related to priming is so interesting to me, that like just the way that you ask a question, and I don't even mean like don't we all hate noodles, like what do we think about noodles, but like just like the way that you phrase a question can have such a huge impact on the survey results or whatever.
Oh yeah,
one of the biggest
even
reasons,
just like the music you play, like if I play soothing music while we're talking, you're probably more likely to be agreeable and nice to me, right?
And the yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then like things like one of the big reasons why you should never talk to the cops is because you might say something dumb and you don't even realize what you're saying, because our default is like being really trusting of other people, and we'll offer more details than we need to, and we'll kind of like, because we always assume that people are acting in good faith generally is like our default assumption. Yeah, there's a lot of like interesting stuff there for sure.
Yeah, I definitely, once you get into kind of, that's more like the realm of like cognitive psychology. It's kind of like scary. It makes you be like, wait, are we just in a matrix? Like, but is the matrix just our brains? Like, you know, yeah, once you like get into that, it kind of like blows your mind and really makes you question a lot of stuff. And I think what's most important about that sort of stuff is that it gives a lot of weight to like non-conscious processing and how important it actually is, because most of this stuff is happening there's an entire visual pathway in your brain that is completely non-conscious, that just like you aren't aware of happening and you respond to it all the time. And even if we destroy your conscious brain, your conscious visual system in your brain, you will report seeing nothing, but you'll, to some extent, be able to interact with the world like you can see it to a certain extent. It's called blind sight. It's a really interesting kind of case study of a woman who had blind sight from a stroke, where she couldn't see anything, but she could like put mails, like a piece of mail, in a mailbox slot, regardless of the orientation or placement of it, right?
Gotcha.
So she was like, I don't see anything. I don't see a mailbox. And they're like, that's okay, just try. And she'd get it in perfectly almost every time. Or like she would bump the edge and then get it in, just like kind of you would expect actually with anyone putting a mail thing of mail in. Yeah, really fast. The brain is an enigma, man. It's crazy. Yeah.
True. Okay.
Should we go back to DID?
I think I'm getting the gist of I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Okay.
Or you seem to that one study about children not being able to recall like well-documented experiences would be interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I like I said, I don't have it on me, but I will send it to you after like this chat, basically. One last study for DID I actually do want to go through was showing actually marked brain differences in people with DID when they were in their other states that we couldn't even falsely create in people who we call them high fantasy prone individuals, which I think is actually probably a term that would be really helpful for you to understand probably lots of people on the internet, because I would imagine more people who are engaged in online stuff and stuff are going to be they tend to just be people who are more gullible. You can put them under hypnosis more often. This isn't to be they're lesser than, but they're people who are engaging kind of like fantastic thinking more often than people who are like really low in it. And so, as you could presume, you can kind of convince them to believe that they have maybe split personalities when they don't, through educating them. Which I don't actually know how the study happened, because I would argue like most ethics boards, I feel like, would strike this study down. But
yeah, fuck. I'm trying to think of what you're talking about, because I think I've had somebody argue against me. It might have been the last girl I argued about with D&D. I wish I could remember. I was playing Rust, and I knew on the map I was running around when she was talking about this. But basically, there was a study where they tried to. I don't know if they told the people that they were studying D, but they tried to present something basically in the way that the people engaged with the questions. It was like, oh, there's actually like, there seems to be a fundamentally different cognitive process that exists here. It's not like just somebody completely faking something. That like there was some other type of recall or some other type of memory recall where it's like they scored really high on this particular thing, and that was pretty consistent with these people were way more likely to have DID or something. Maybe we're not talking about exactly the same study, but...
I don't think it's the exact same study. There's been a lot of studies on DID people. The main thing is that they went under an MRI basically, and what we saw is that like when you're at a resting brain state, everyone has a bit of like a resting brain, almost like thumbprint a little bit, and it is unique between individuals, and there'll be obvious overlap between all individuals, but it's going to look a little bit different between all people, and so the key thing is, if you're resting and then we trigger you to be in a different personality, if you have a legitimate separate personality, theoretically we might see that the resting brain waves differ while you're in that state basically. And so they tested this by having low fantasy prone people, high fantasy prone people, who are the best, who were like the closest controls we could have to DID people, and people who are diagnosed with DID, and we compared, and basically we trained the controls, the low and high fantasy prone people, basically about DID. We taught them how basically, because actually with DID people you can trigger alters to come out through different like sensory cues or verbal cues, stuff like that. So they trained them basically on that, taught them a lot about kind of intrafamilial systems therapy and how we all have different parts to us and how you can draw these parts are, and in some cases they can even be full separate identities, and the other identities are actually non-conscious at that time, right? So as you can imagine, low fantasy prone people were kind of like, this is bullshit, I don't think that actually happens for me. High fantasy prone people were probably more like, oh, that's really interesting, I wonder if it happens to me, I bet you it does happen. And then you kind of convince them that it could happen to them. And then we had DID individuals that we did no education with, and then we put them in an MRI and just looked at their resting brain waves between basically alters, and we'd be like, okay, and we would basically, they don't go into details in the study about how they triggered precisely, probably for ethical reasons why they didn't go into it, just because you don't want to like teach random people
how to
trigger swaps and stuff like that. So anyways, what we saw was that there was a pretty marked difference in the DID people when they swapped, and there wasn't this difference in the resting brainwaves in high prone individuals when they claimed they had swapped personalities.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So it's definitely interesting. I think DID is still going to be contentious for a while, in large part because it's like, how do you see who's faking or not? Because you can't just stick everyone under an MRI, obviously, either, right?
Yeah. It was interesting that in the beginning of this conversation, I feel like I've talked about this like 3 different times, 3 different psychologists who've all come on to talk about like DID. It was interesting at the beginning of this conversation, you brought up the frustration with the sometimes the overvaluation of like clinical psychologists versus research psychologists, and that was the main criticism that I'd heard in the DSM-5 for the only reason DID made it in there was because the DSM-5 overrepresented for clinical psychologist experience versus researcher experience, and a lot of researchers were upset because they were like, oh, well, you guys you're not taking us seriously enough, like it shouldn't even be in here or whatever. So it's interesting that you come from the research side, but you seem to be on the opposite side of that for the DID thing, or maybe the research has changed also, because the DSM-5 is pretty old at this point, right? Like how many...
Well, the DSM-4 that they're referring to had multiple personality disorder. They just called it multiple personality disorder. They didn't have DID. It was just labeled something. That's kind of what I'm confused on. I mean, like, which DSM did they think didn't have it? Because the DSM-4 TR did have multiple personality disorder as a diagnosis, and the DSM-5 just changed it to a dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah, I think the thing that my understanding of what was frustrating was the concept of dissociative amnesia I think is still somewhat contentious, because I think there's
Yes.
still a lot of debate over what even is a dissociative experience, or is dissociative amnesia possible. And there are so few cases of this, it's hard to get like a big quantitative, like, oh, like we gathered, 280,000 patients with DID, and this is what we researched. It's really hard. A lot of it is still built on case studies. And then historically speaking, I'm sure that there's still like a lot of iffy people in the field because of the Sybil girl or whatever. Are you familiar with her?
No.
There was one girl her case study was like, I think, the landmark case study for multiple personalities, and I think near her death, basically it was revealed that everything was fake. It was all complete bullshit. And I think that probably was a big setback for a lot of that research as well. Or at least a lot of people willing to engage with it. So I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, and like I think there's a fair hesitation within the field, and I even though I'm saying I believe in it, I wouldn't even discourage the hesitation. I think the hesitation is well founded and wise, and we should probably maintain hesitation around it. I'm just on the side of basically saying, like, I believe that there are dissociative disorders. I'm not sure to what extent I believe about this like full amnesic stuff, but as somebody who is like been friends with people who I find very credible, and had also they kind of had like, so there is something called OSDD, which is like other specified dissociative disorder. So it's like dissociative disorders that aren't necessarily dissociative identity. So what you might like disappear a little bit and operate and have like a massive gap in your memory, but you wouldn't really call it like a separate identity came out. There's a varied number of these things, and I am friends with somebody who literally, like, they claim that they did experience it and that those parts integrated, and they do remember like waking up like after 2 hours and having like stolen stuff and being like, I really don't remember this, and through like trauma and like EMDR and like reprocessing trauma and stuff like that, they were able to like integrate those things and they no longer experience it, right? And so when I hear about things like that, I'm like, the brain is so wild and crazy that while we should be hesitant, we've had so many, I think, like, do you know the researcher Ramachandran?
Well, I do, but you might want to refresh him for chat, of course.
Sure, yeah. He's just basically like a really popular neuroscientist. He really studies a lot about like neuroplasticity, and kind of he's at like the avant-garde, basically, of like neurological research. And he talks a lot about this idea of like, I struggle because I feel like all my researchers and peers are saying, show me a talking pig. And then I'm like, okay, ready? And then I wave a wand over a pig and then it talks. And I'm like, here's a talking pig. And then all my peers go, yeah, but show me another, right? And so I think what we're at like with brain science right now is like, we know so much that now we know that we know so very little, and brains are so incredibly flexible and changeable based on like experiences, that it's hard to like pin your hand down and say like, this is absolutely can't be true, because we've seen like phantom limbs be like cured by like an illusion box, right? And it's like you just never would have expected that to ever be possible, but it does, and now it's a standard treatment for phantom limb pain. So I think that's the trick, is just like, and this is why I'm like, diagnosis is actually really complicated, because like in part the brain is an enigma and we have to be careful with our diagnoses. And like, you should be having like, a hot take, I don't even think general practitioner like doctors should be diagnosing mental health problems. I actually don't think that they have the training required for it, because of the nature of where we're at with like neuroscience and stuff. Like we don't know enough. That like, unless you're really versed on like complex things and how drugs, I mean, there's cases of like people diagnosed with ADHD as children, they go on drugs, it turns out that all along they had OCD, but because of the stimulants they also developed Tourette's syndrome, right? Like there's crazy stuff that happens with like misdiagnosis, which is why I think we have to be careful. We have to do this weird balance of being conservative and careful, but also open-minded to the fact that like there's probably so much we don't know about the brain right now. And in 10 years we're going to be looking back and like laughing at ourselves.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Well, anything else?
Yeah. Trying to think about anything else. I'm trying to think about how long we've been going for, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. Because I think you have a chat with somebody else pretty soon here, correct?
Yeah, but if there's anything else you can think of, any other big talking points or anything? Yeah,
the main one would be therapy. I think that I think I have a differing perspective on therapy than maybe you do, on like the purpose of it. Um, that's probably different than a lot of people potentially within the field. Probably
Mm-hmm.
not a ton of people, but a number of them, which is basically kind of the argument of like, should therapy be short term or long term?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and kind of what goes into that. I think like, um, I think short-term therapy really came around because of insurance first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely think that there are short-term forms of therapy that are valid, are good, and should be used. The problem is that we see like the effects of therapy um, don't seem to last super long. And I think that that's an important thing to talk about of like we've really medicalized mental health when I think that probably we need to have a different lens of how we view mental health. In part because I think the medicalization has led to kind of some of this hopelessness. I'm just this, and so there's no point anymore, right? I just have depression, so there's no point in trying anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I actually like really try to challenge people on therapy of being like, absolutely, therapy is there to like present you with skills, those short-term forms of therapy where they give you some basic CBT skills, some basic mindfulness skills, they kind of give you some psychoeducation, and they like give you some positive rapport
Mm-hmm.
even, and just like nice interactions for a couple weeks can absolutely be beneficial. The problem is that like we see the effects of it wane off pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it feels like the and this is kind of the argument for why some people do short-term therapy is because therapy wanes off after time. But what we do see in like there are some studies that show like people who do long-term therapy, while the effects may be more slow because they do maybe like a psychodynamic approach,
Mm-hmm.
um, they actually lead to more stable changes long term because they're just immersing their client for like 2 years into like a different way of like viewing their whole world and like grieving and processing their experiences of the past and like getting to have like a new narrative and kind of like what psychodynamics might call like you're kind of like taking your present self and sending it back in time to rescue your like child self and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is very like artsy and floozy, but there's definitely some evidence coming out that like these longer forms of therapy, while it's kind of obnoxious that they're so long because we can't pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
um, they
I
seem to have more stable impacts long term.
Something that would be, so I can't disagree with you because I'm pretty sure everything you're saying is 100% correct. But the only difference is, or the interesting part is that it feels like you're placing a fundamentally different or greater burden on mental health than we would around health, or physical health, I should say. So I think that when we go to hospitals, the primary goal is that they're moving you to a place where you're basically not dying. Or like your body is like has some minimal level of functioning, and that's like the goal when we go to a hospital. When I go to a hospital, I expect them to fix, if I have like some like an infarction or if I'm having like some serious medical, I expect them to fix that. But I don't expect to go to a hospital to get like better cardiovascular health or like better like more muscles or whatever. I wouldn't expect that from a hospital. But it feels like when we talk about mental health. This idea of like the infinity therapy is we're no longer talking about just like curing ailments or whatever, but we're talking about like a long-term, like making somebody healthy, not just not dying, which I guess is a far bigger burden than what we would expect of like traditional medicine, I guess.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point and an important point, and it's actually why I argue. So part of why I have this view is because I think actually a lot of mental health practitioners occupy a space where normally community and mentors would traditionally probably have filled.
Hmm. Or sometimes even
Um,
like, unfortunately, like parents, right? Or just
mhm.
friends, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, parents or friends, right? And I think it's kind of this like modern solution we have to a modern problem, right? It's kind of that thing that sometimes people talk about of like we have all these modern problems, and then we like rather than like giving it like the simplest answer of being like why don't we just like have healthier communities, we're like no, we're going to create this new field and train all these specialists to go out there and be professional friends and mentors to everyone. And rather than exchanging like basically like tit for tat a relationship of being like I'll mentor you now if you like care for me when I'm an old person because I don't have children,
Hmm.
instead you're just going to give me money, right? That's kind of like the tit for tat we trade now. And so I definitely agree to an extent. I think like the problem is that I actually suspect that we have mental health problems that are like much more like biological and more medical in nature.
Hmm.
Like but there's kind of depressions being now split into like a biological form of depression versus a stress depression, right? A stress depression, to be honest, like you can go to a therapist, and I would encourage you to if that's like what would solve you. But a lot of times, what solves stress depression is removing the major stressors that are making you depressed, right? If your boss is a bastard to you all the time, probably the best way to solve that is to find a new workplace, which is again easier said than done for a lot of people. But sometimes the reason people are depressed is because their life has been really terrible. Right?
Yeah, and I think the problem is that and that's kind of, so maybe we agree, maybe we don't disagree, I guess, but like it feels like we're asking medical health professionals to solve for like environments, which is impossible.
Yes.
Like no amount of medication or therapy is going to do as much for depression as like huge fundamental lifestyle changes. And I would say probably even in the case of like medical, real major depressive disorder, like even in that case, like things like a better diet, better sleep schedule, better social functioning are going to do more for you than just like, you know, having medication and therapy. But it's the problem, the reason why people are probably asking so much of the therapist and everything is that it's changing all of society is a lot harder than just creating a new discipline to kind of like band-aid the problems, I guess, is the difficult thing.
Yeah, I agree. I like that's the problem though, is like as a psychologist, I try to steer away from like trying to advocate strongly for major social changes because I recognize that I'm probably not the most informed. I can give you my opinion, but it's not my professional opinion, it's my personal opinion, right?
Yeah.
About being like, yeah, I would like to see like systems in Sweden where they have like these community living apartments where they like have to share a kitchen area and they have to have like one meal together and they get reduced rent, and it's the whole idea is it's kind of the government forcing people to have community, right? I absolutely would be for that. I agree with you. There's strong evidence. Something like schizophrenia, which we would call a very biological mental health problem, it experiences remission in like Latina and like African villages way more often than it ever does in like North America. Like people with schizophrenia, honestly, they do better in Latin American countries broadly, which is like crazy because their medical interventions for it of getting them on like tranks and stuff like that are way less, which is super interesting. So I definitely would agree. Probably most mental health problems could be better adjusted for by just making societal wide changes, right? As we've reduced religion in our culture, whether you think that's good or bad, it has removed a major form of like community bonding that was happening. So how do we replace that in a less religious society? Well, we need to figure that out because people are sad, anxious, and depressed. And most of that can be fixed by just giving them friends. And right now we're band-aiding it by giving them like a mental health therapist. And some CBT skills, but CBT skills won't fix your problems if your problems are that you just like don't have intimate relationships with people where you feel seen, right? And so I definitely think that like we probably actually agree on this more than I originally like presumed. I just wanted to be clear, like I think short-term therapy is actually like I value it a lot less than probably like a lot more, and I think the reason why it even like came into existence is largely because insurance didn't want to pay for long form therapy.
And you support long-term therapy, not necessarily long-term therapy, but more so that like we have to recognize that to fix some problems in our lives, it's not going to be like a you know, 2 months of sessions and then you're done. Now you fix all of your interpersonal problems if no other changes in your life are happening.
Yeah, and my view of long-term therapy isn't like you should be in therapy for 10 years straight, once a week, every week. My view is like probably you need to be in for like 2 to 3 months every week. And after that, you should probably do check-ins like once every 6 months, once every year, kind of like a doctor more so. But it should actually be more standardized of like you just do your check-ins, because it's like if we have these people as band-aids for now, probably the better system is to allow them to continue to be band-aids. Obviously, if we could have social reform that changes that, if we have more community living that maybe happens or something like that, I'd be more for that. But that's just not the world that we live in right now.
Unfortunately,
yeah. I guess one last question somebody recommended I ask is, do you have any recommendations for me on Twitch and where I should go from here?
I don't know. Do the panel shows. It's good to have women that aren't fucking insane on this platform. I think that generally the stereotype is true that like if you have women on the platform, they tend to be like very ultra super far left on everything, and that's like going to be the point of view. So I think it's good to have like more moderating voices. I think it's really positive. So yeah, I mean, keep doing the panel shows and have the representation is good. Yeah.
Awesome. Anyone you think I should like talk to specifically or reach out to?
Yeah, there's a one of the most intellectual debaters on the platform goes by the name Demon Mama.
Oh no.
Yeah, this is somebody very well versed background in psychology. I think it'd be interesting to talk to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we disagree on most things. 'Cause she's the individual who's really pro self-diagnosis, correct?
I don't want to taint your view of that person, and I think you should go in with an open mind.
Don't want to
instead
poison
of
the well.
being
That's fair.
Yeah, don't be so closed-minded that who knows what they believe. It changes
True.
day to day. So, yeah, I think I don't know. Like, the problem is that like this is gonna sound self-congratulatory. I'll talk to anybody, but the people that I tend to have the biggest disagreements with seem not to all the time. So yeah, I don't know. I like talking to one of those people that have a huge disagreement, but with you have an educated background would be interesting. The frustrating thing for me is that like I said, like usually when I talk to like really educated people, we're usually agreeing on like 98% of things. But then whenever I talk to people that disagree with me, they say that like, oh, like, you're just looking for people that agree with you. You just circle jerk all the time. Like you don't engage with the data. But I was like, okay, well, I mean, I try, like find me somebody that disagrees with me and we can have that conversation, but they never seem to want to. So
Yeah, that's fair and frustrating for sure.
you can also try talking to Vosh too. That's another guy that Demon Mama adjacent. Maybe he would be interested in it. So
Okay. All right, I'll keep those names on the list. I know a lot of people keep saying Mr. Girl, but I don't know if that's just because he's kind of like the popular person to talk to right now.
oh yeah, he's definitely interesting, but my frustrating thing with Mr. Girl is you'll end up agreeing. I think you'll end up agreeing with 99% of what he says, but it's only once you've chewed through the kind of the weird, I'll call it semantic garbage. So like I might say something like, therapy is horrible. Nobody should be in therapy. And then you'll be like, well, what do you mean by that? Isn't therapy important? It's like, no. What you should have is a relationship with somebody that maybe you have to pay some amount of money to talk to every now and then to get through your problems. But therapy is garbage. Like it'll be like something like that. I'm like, okay, sure.
Okay.
But yeah, it might be interesting to chat with him. He's a very interesting guy to chat with, so I definitely wouldn't discourage it. But yeah.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, if you ever want to chat again, or you come across stuff that you would like to address around psychology, or a view you come across, definitely don't be hesitant to hit you up, and I'll try to pay attention to your stuff and see if there's anything else I hear of in the future that I have strong contentions over.
Yeah, just let me know if I say anything you disagree with. So yeah, have fun.